Hi, I'm Gia for the George Washington Cold War Channel. With me today in the studio is Professor Matthew Dallek, who is an associate professor of political management at the George Washington University. He recently published a book titled Defenseless Under the Night. Welcome to the studio.
Thanks so much for having me.
What did you think about Monday's debate?
It was interesting. It was absolutely one of the more fascinating presidential debates I've seen. It was somewhat reminiscent of a number of moments, at least over the past 15 years, in which one of the debaters, one of the candidates, the mannerisms and the style, the interjections, the voice, the body language became part of the story. So Al Gore, the sighing in 2000, the sort of sense of condescension that a lot of people picked up on. George W. Bush in 2004 saying, being president is hard work. You know, it was a very poor performance in that first debate. And then in 2012, President Obama's first debate against Mitt Romney, where he really didn't engage very much and by all accounts was just not very sharp. So the story, interestingly, became partly about, Trump is a different animal, of course, but it became about his rambling comments, his constant interruptions, his shouting, saying, where did you find this? Where did you find this? And that became, I think, part of the received wisdom, at least, about the debate immediately and then also in the kind of post-debate spin.
Hillary Clinton, a former First Lady, is now the first female candidate for a major political party running for president. And you've also written about Eleanor Roosevelt, who was an influential figure during her time. So do you think it's fair to say she paved the way for Clinton in the political field?
I would say yes and no. So it's very interesting because Hillary Clinton, when she was First Lady, took Eleanor Roosevelt as her role model, right? And other First Ladies do, but I think Hillary Clinton, in terms of her activism as First Lady, her expansive view of the role of First Lady, did in fact draw from Eleanor Roosevelt in a way that really no other First Lady had quite done. The other interesting parallel is that Hillary Clinton in 1993 became the second presidential spouse in history to hold essentially an official position in the administration while First Lady. And the first one was Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was appointed as Assistant Director in charge of volunteer participation at the Office of Civilian Defense, as I write about in Defenseless Under the Night in my book. Hillary Clinton, of course, became the chair of the Healthcare Task Force, became really the prime agent and chief communicator for pushing a healthcare reform. So there are some really interesting parallels. Now, having said that, Eleanor Roosevelt was still unique in the history, I think, of First Ladies, the history of presidential spouses. She had her own voice, her own views. She wrote a 6-day-a-week syndicated column. She gave speeches. She had her own press conferences. She oftentimes said things that were at odds with Franklin Roosevelt's positions on, for example, mandating universal service for young people. So there is no one still, I think, quite like Eleanor Roosevelt. However, there was talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was encouraged by some supporters to run for office. She said no. In fact, at one point, I think someone said, you should run for president. She said no. Now, part of it was, too, she also talked about she did not think that even though she was a real force for bringing women into the administration, for making sure that women had positions of power at the highest of levels as much as possible, she also wrote an article and argued at times that women needed to build up the political and governmental experience before they could essentially seek the presidency. So she obviously never ran for office, even though she was incredibly influential. But her comments, in a sense, presaged. It was sort of a forerunner to what we're seeing today, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton is one of the most experienced, not just the first woman a nominee of a major party, but really one of the most, if not the most experienced, but one of the most experienced nominees in modern times of any party. And in a sense, I think, because of the discrimination and the barriers that women have faced in politics and in other areas, I think Eleanor Roosevelt was able to kind of forecast that, in a sense, a woman who runs has got to, be super experienced. It's kind of like the old adage, working twice as hard. So I do think that there are some parallels, that Eleanor Roosevelt remains an inspiration for Hillary Clinton, but it is also conceivable that if we never had Eleanor Roosevelt, we could still have Hillary Clinton running.
So you recently wrote that there are some parallels between this year's election and also the elections in 1968 and 1988. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't want to overstate anything, because I think, history does not necessarily repeat itself. But I do think that there are some interesting parallels between these two Cold War era elections. 1968, George Wallace running as a third party, independent party candidate on very much of a pro-segregation, kind of pro-white identity platform, took 13.5% of the vote, and made a very explicit appeal to working class whites, to non-college educated whites. He talked about the policeman on the beat, the steel worker, the worker in the mills, the beautician. And he tapped, even though he only got 13.5% of the vote, he did tap into that. He kind of fused, along with Nixon, who obviously won. I think together they fused concerns about civil rights, about law and order, and about urban unrest. And these are all themes that Trump, I think, has also fused. And 68 election helped splinter the so-called New Deal coalition. And Trump, I think, is making a lot of explicit appeals to white identity, to cracking, being the strong man, cracking down on crime, and being tough on national security. So I think that there are some real echoes, and Trump is actually explicitly in his convention address, he pulled from Nixon, from some of those themes. Now, 1988 is interesting to me, at least, because you had basically an incumbent vice president running, in a sense, for a third Reagan term. George H.W. Bush, was not a great campaigner, not nearly as beloved as Ronald Reagan, but was trying to, in a sense, channel some of Reagan's popularity to make the case, at the same time that he was trying to really make his opponent, Michael Dukakis, unelectable, by arguing that this is a soft on crime, super liberal Democrat from Massachusetts. And through his appeals, some of them really race-based, like the Willie Horton ad, he was able, I think, in a sense, to help discredit Dukakis as not mainstream. In the same light, Hillary Clinton, who is not, according to the polls, not as popular as Barack Obama, not as trusted as Barack Obama, but is essentially running for a third term, and running on his legacy, to continue the legacy. And at the same time, she's trying to make Donald Trump so unelectable, so unpopular. And it's that combination that I think is an interesting dynamic between then and now.
Last but not least, I wanted to ask you about the meaning of your book title. It's Defenseless Under the Night. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so the title is taken from a poem, a fairly well-known poem by W.H. Auden, called September 1, 1939. And in the poem, Auden talks about sitting in a bar in New York City, and he talks about humanity and on the verge of mass destruction and catastrophic death. And there are optimistic tones in the poem, but it is also quite bleak. And there's a line in which he says, defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies. And he says, besotted everywhere, I think, by something about points of light. And what I think appealed to me about the title is that it connotes a sense of vulnerability and also a sense of darkness. And of course, he's referring to the shadow of Nazi fascism over Europe, over the globe. And remember, this is the very beginning, September 1939, so the very beginning of World War II. And where there's also a sense that new military technologies harness to fascist militarism and a targeting of civilians as well. This idea of total war means everybody is on the front line. And so I think it also connects to that. Much of the book is about cities in the United States and sort of the sense of vulnerability and the questions about public safety and the role of citizens. And so I think it captures some of that as well. And so I think it felt like it worked and it felt fresh to me, and hopefully it does to readers as well.
Absolutely, it ties really well with the byline that says the Roosevelt years and the origins of the Homeland Security. Thanks so much for being here today, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed being on the show.